6th, and we're in Santa Barbara. Would you please stand and join me for the Pledge of Allegiance? Ms. Contreras, would you please give us the TV coverage announcement?
Thank you. Planning Commission hearings are televised live on County Santa Barbara Television, Channel 20, at 9 a.m. in the South Coast, Lompoc, San Ynez Valley, Santa Maria, and Orcutt areas. Rebroadcasts of Planning Commission hearings are on Fridays at 5 p.m. on CSB TV Channel 20. For the roll call, Commissioner Boyson?
Here.
Commissioner Brown?
Here.
Commissioner Cooney?
Here.
Commissioner Smizer?
Here.
Commissioner Valencia?
Here. All right, thank you very much. And now the agenda status report. Ms. Contreras? Or Ms. Mendoza?
Mr. Chair, actually, I'm going to do it this morning,
Oh, all right.
just to confuse you. This morning, item number 1, the HIRA appeal is scheduled to go forward, so that'll be the first regular item that you take up this morning. The Horrigan Residential Development, we were hopeful that this item was ready, and we believed that we were ready to go forward, but there have been some discrepancies determined between the BAR plans and the plans we've been reviewing, and so we feel like we need some additional time and are actually, I think, requesting that this be dropped and we'd renotice it, but we'll take that up when we begin the agenda. Number 3 is also being requested to be continued, and I know that the applicant's attorney is here and wants to address you on this. Your staff's recommending that it be dropped and renoticed, and I think the appellant is requesting that it be continued to a specific date, so we can take that up in a moment. The zoning enforcement recommendations were not noticed properly because we actually wanted to bring ordinances forward to your commission, and so we will be dropping this from the agenda and renoticing it into for a future date. And on your projection report, we're asking the commission to do this on September 7th after your joint meeting with the Montecito Planning Commission on the zoning ordinance reformatting project. I don't think this is a very complex issue, and hopefully we can accomplish it because you don't have much agenda space until then. And then the final item will be heard today, and that's the Community Planning Renaissance Oak Tree guidelines item.
All right,
So,
thank you.
That's where we are.
Ms. Meester, will you be giving us the projection report?
Yes, Mr. Chair. Today, I think we will probably be finished with your agenda in the morning, so that's the good news. It looked like you had a very full agenda, and it looks like you'll probably be done this morning. August 2nd is another Santa Barbara hearing, and you have about a half a day. That agenda has been noticed, and so unless something's continued to that date, you can expect about 4.5 hours of work on the 2nd of August. And Mr. Chase will be sitting with your commission on that date, as I'll be out of town. On August 9th in Santa Maria, you also have relatively full day, about a 5-hour hearing projection, depending on how items go and if anything gets continued to that date as well. And on that date, Ms. Abrish will be sitting with you, as I'll still be gone. Then the 23rd of August, I'll be back. And you have a full day at 7.25 hours. You also have a fairly full day. Then the following day, we set a special hearing that day for the uniform rules, Keysite 30, the Brakeburn Energy Project, and Hayes Holden. So that's a full day. That'll be a Santa Maria hearing. The 23rd will be in Santa Barbara. And then continue on into September. We do have a special hearing set for September 7th for the zoning ordinance reformatting project. That'll be in Santa Barbara, and then a Santa Maria hearing September 13th. That's also full. So your commission's pretty busy through the middle of September with a couple of special hearings and some fairly full days. We are bringing the Environmental Health Services briefing to your Planning Commission on August 23rd and intend to bring the Gaviota Coast briefing to your commission on September 6th, assuming that that space isn't needed for another permit item. So we've got a lot coming forward to the commission.
All right,
Okay.
thank you very much. At this time, we'll go on to the public comment area. If there's anybody here who would like to speak on anything that's not on today's agenda, please come forward. Seeing no one rise, we'll close the public comment period. And I'd like to say hello to my grandchildren who came in from San Jose to visit me, especially for this meeting. Trent and Taylor, I know you're out there. Hello. And now you can go back to your cartoons. All right, Planning Commissioner's informational reports. Commissioner Brown.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to give you all a little bit of information about the September 27th item on the agenda on the Goleta's residential design guidelines, which we've, staff and a few of community members have been working hard to draft. We met with the BAR last week as our second meeting, and we're down in the final stretch, and we're looking forward to coming to the commission on the end of September. So it's a very timely topic because it deals with neighborhood design guidelines and for single-family homes and things like neighborhood compatibility, where we've seen a lot of appeals and a lot of interest in the community. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Anybody else? Commissioner Smyser?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just, a note for housekeeping. On our last meeting, we postponed we continued the coffee lot split until what date was that?
September 6th.
September the 6th. And then we were going to have a meeting regarding these new septic systems. And that was going to be...
That's correct. It's August 23rd. The Environmental Health Services staff will be coming to the commission,
Mr.
Okay.
Jensen?
providing that briefing. Yes, I believe it will be Mr. Jensen.
Could I also request, since that meeting with the coffee lot split, I've had a number of water companies in the Santa Ynez Valley contact me and request an opportunity to address the Planning Commission regarding the issue of septic fields in Santa Ynez. And I think it would be appropriate to invite them to that meeting.
Okay. So would you like us to send them some sort of a notice about the
sounds fine
August
to me.
23rd meeting?
That would be great.
Okay.
All right, staff will take care of that.
Yes, we will.
All right, very good. And anything else from the planning commissioners? All right, if not, we'll go on to Planning and Development Divisional briefings. Do we have a briefing today, Ms. Meester?
Mr. Chair, I don't believe there's any briefings this morning.
All right, and everybody received a copy of the minutes, July 5th and July 12th. What's the wishes of the commission?
I'll make a motion, Mr. Chair, to approve the minutes of July 5th.
Thank you. Do we have a second? Commissioner Smyser?
I wasn't there. I can't second that one.
All
I'll
right.
second that.
All right, thank you, Commissioner Boyson. Ms. Contreras, could you call the roll, please?
Commissioner Boyson,
Aye.
Commissioner Brown,
Aye.
Commissioner Cooney,
Aye.
Commissioner Smyser,
Abstain.
Commissioner Valencia.
Aye.
Vote carries.
All right, and
4-1,
now July
4-0-1.
12th, have the same motion. Commissioner,
And I'll move to approve.
thank you, Commissioner Boyson,
I'll second that.
and thank you, Commissioner Smyser. All right. Yes, we have a question.
Just a couple of small things, Mr. Chair. On the second page of these minutes, refer to the Rapinos Supreme Court case that I discussed under item 8. And I just want to correct a little bit. In the last sentence there, we use the word regarding twice, and if we take out the second regarding, Ms. Contreras, then it says the cases that involve 4 Michigan wetlands, and then I would just add the words, and the Federal Clean Water Act, because I think that was really the key issue being discussed, and it will make it clear for someone looking at it years ahead. Then on page 3, under item 2, the action, I'm not sure why we number these 1 when we only have one item, but that's stylistic, I guess. With regard to the word withdrawal, I think we want to use the word withdraw there, so just take off the AL. That's it.
All right. Thank
And
you,
Commissioner
Cooney.
Cooney wonders why I'm so hesitant to move for approval. He always proves that he has read these
Ms.
with
Contreras,
more scrutiny.
Ms. Contreras has gotten in the practice of hiding 1 or 2 of these little typos in every set of minutes. So if you approve and don't correct, she knows you're not reading carefully.
Absolutely, and a point well taken. And so I would amend my motion to approve the minutes as amended.
All right.
And
thank
I
you.
will amend my second.
All right, thank you. Does that meet with your approval, Commissioner Cooney?
Absolutely.
All right. Ms. Contreras, would you call the roll, please?
Commissioner Boyson?
Aye.
Commissioner Brown?
Aye.
Commissioner Cooney?
Aye.
Commissioner Smyser?
Aye.
Commissioner Valencia?
All right, hi.
Oh,
Director's
Commissioner Smyser.
report of Board of Supervisors hearing summary.
Mr. Chair and members of the Commission, introduce myself formally, John Baker. Started as director a week ago last Monday, and I will be taking the opportunity over the next few weeks to meet with you individually, so just to get to know you and so you'll get to know me. I won't go through the spiel that Mike Brown did for the Montecito Planning Commission last week. I come to you from a background in local government for the last 30 plus years, and looking forward to the opportunities and the challenges that are here with the Planning and Development Department. I wanted to say a few things that, in terms of my intentions, I don't plan to get into individual cases in any depth. There are just too many of them. What I'm going to rely on is what I think so far I've learned that there's some very talented planners that work for this county. I plan to rely on them to give you quality reports. For those that are of significance, I'm going to get into them because of the policy matters that may be involved and such. But and you'll hear from me on those. But otherwise, I'm going to let Steve Chase and Zoraida and their planners give you the kinds of good quality reports that are there. I invite your comments and suggestions on anything we can do to make your process and therefore our process more effective. I don't use the word efficient because I'm not sure that it always means efficiency, but effectiveness can include efficiency if it's appropriate. I come from a background of, in the last 8-10 years, of dealing as a consultant on with a number of cities and counties on the development review process. And I have an intent to go through and be looking at the process and see if there are ways that we can improve it. So that there's better decision making by the planners, better decision making by the commission, and I think most appropriately that the community that uses our services knows what's going on a continuing basis. So I'm looking forward to looking at those processes. With regard to the Board of Supervisors hearing yesterday, I'm going to report on 3 things. Number 1, the compensation ordinance was approved on the first reading. I will say there was 1 no vote, and that no vote wasn't looking at in any way the quality of the work that the Planning Commission does. It was just saying, you know, in comparison to other planning commissions, supervisor felt that the compensation was above what is comparable, and that was her reason for voting no other reason. So we'll have second reading next week, and that will be by us. The other comment that was made was the concern about site visit trips numbers, and essentially looking at, you know, if there are site visits, it would be remuneration on the basis of a site visit, not multiple times going to the same site. Was a concern that was raised, but other than that, those are the only concerns. The second item was the Loraldi rezoning, which was approved with a 5-0 vote. There was 1 comment from Supervisor Carbajal that although this rezoning in and of itself did not include any development, that it opens the door for that potential, and that was the concern, that there could be some precedent set, recognizing that as we go through the process, if there is an application, that issue will be fully aired. So so that you're aware but that was the only comment that was really made on it. The third one was the Orcutt Town streetscape plan, which got glowing reports and was approved on a 5-0 vote. And I will say that the only comment that I really heard sitting there, because I was not there for the whole hearing, but toward the end, was some concerns that they're going to do some special studies, particularly with relation to traffic. And that if those studies change the concept plan, then we'll come back and change the concept plan. But they were highly supportive of the work that had been done for the town center plan, or the streetscape plan. So with that, I'm glad to be here and look forward to meeting with each one of you.
Well, welcome aboard. I'm glad you're here. We've been without a department head for some time, although it's been running okay, but I'm sure that we needed one for some reason or other. And I know that you're going to have a...
I do have one more item.
Right.
When you come back on August, or when you see her again on August 23rd, you will not say Ms. Meester. It's Ms. Black.
It's who?
Black.
Oh.
New name.
New name. Well, congratulations, Ms. Meester. And Commissioner Cooney.
Thank you, Mr. Baker. Welcome. I look forward to visiting with you in the weeks ahead. Just a couple of things with regard to the compensation issue, because I have been involved in that, even addressed the board at one point about that issue on behalf of the commission. Our request, and as I understood, the ordinance was drafted so that any adjustment in compensation was to be effective as of January of next year. And it wasn't mentioned by the board, but I think it's an important fact. The commission did not feel that it should do anything on its behalf to benefit the current commission, but when the commission a new commission is appointed after the first of the year, this would go into effect with regard to them. And for the purposes of comparing what different counties do, we did quite a study of that, and it was felt by this commission that the workload is such that an additional amount of compensation might attract people from the community who would otherwise be qualified but unable to serve due to the fact that so much time is taken without compensation. I don't know if you had a chance to review the ordinance, but I'm fairly certain the effective date for any compensation
that is
the
correct.
first of the year. The second issue is with regard to the reimbursement of mileage for site visits. Ms. Meester can correct me, but I believe that the ordinance provided before its proposed amendment for reimbursement to commissioners for site visits. At least it's been the practice here to reimburse for site visits. So I think that was a false issue. Those have been reimbursed. Now, Commissioner Centeno, in his statement yesterday, seemed to indicate, and he's done this before, that he didn't want multiple site visits reimbursed. So I think it would require for that change, for the amendment, another amendment to be made to the ordinance to restrict reimbursement to one site visit. If that is put forth by Supervisor Centeno, I'd like to give that more consideration, because it's been my experience that site visits are absolutely crucial to this commission's consideration of projects, and for some very significant projects like the Gaviota Coast, we've already had 2 instances where site visits have been required on the the San Marcos Preserve project. We had 9 different hearings. It would be ludicrous if each time there's a change in the project by the developer, the commission is constrained from going to see it. So I really think Supervisor Centeno misunderstands this particular issue, and if it is suggested that the ordinance be amended to limit the commission to one site visit for reimbursement purposes, there should be a full discussion of that policy.
In addition to that, you're correct, Commissioner Cooney. In addition to that, there was a project on Highway 154 just before you came in, which was very controversial. This project was been before the commission for several years. It finally got approved and passed on to the Board of Supervisors. That site, I know I personally made 6 visits to that site. I only charged one site to the county. I think I only charged one site, and I recall on several occasions I saw Commissioner Boyson there, I saw Commissioner Farr, I saw many of the other commissioners there doing site visits, and we pick up a lot of the costs, and that's unfair for him to make a comment like that.
Mr. Chair, I did, and members of the commission, I did speak with Supervisor Centeno, and because he had expressed this concern at budget hearings, and Commissioner Cooney, you're correct. What the ordinance revision does is it provides for mileage compensation for other meetings, and site visits have always been compensated. But what I indicated to Supervisor Centeno is the commission doesn't go out to site visits just to go to site visits. And typically on a normal item, the commission visits a site once. And that we have controls in place to review your reimbursement requests. And if we saw anything out of the ordinary, that didn't seem appropriate, then we have ways to address that, and we discuss it with the commissioner. But that, I assured him that the commission does not, in any way abuse this provision in the ordinance. And I think he just wanted to indicate on the record for his constituents that it was the intent that one site visit occur compensated on each site. Obviously, there are some very complex projects on occasion that come, and I don't think anybody would fault the commission for spending more time. And I know that the commission goes to great lengths, if only just for their own scheduling purposes, to visit more than one site at a time and to be efficient about it. So I think the board understands that.
It's a misconception to think that anybody would drive 100 miles to get $15 for 3 or 4 hours. I mean, it's unbelievable. Right. Commissioner Boyson.
And Ms. Meester brings, I hesitate to weigh into this, and I hate to even drag this along, but Ms. Meester brings up a good point. This thing, we were brutalized in the North County press, as Commissioner Valencia knows very well, when this item was going through the hearing stages in the Planning Commission. And all that I saw was Supervisor Centeno responding to some of those criticisms that, hey, we are not out to allow expenses to go crazy, and we are watching expenses. And I have not talked to Supervisor Centeno personally on this, but I honestly do believe that was the gist of his going forward. He sincerely feels, and I have talked to him on this point, he sincerely feels that everyone on this planning commission puts forth 110% effort, and is no one on any of the commissions at the County of Santa Barbara, or any of the volunteers for the County of Santa Barbara, are adequately compensated for their absolute time. And he does realize that these are volunteer, and he appreciates everything that is done for the county by the commissioner. So I just want to throw that in, and hopefully this will just all go away. So
thank you very much, Commissioner Boyson. All right, anybody else? All right, and with that, we'll go on to the standard agenda. Our first item, we have an item to drop, and so while we set up for that, we'll take a 2-minute break. We're going to take item number 3 out of order. Is that correct? Ms. Contreras, could you read that into the record?
Mr. Chair, why don't we go ahead and take item number 2, and then we'll move to item number 3. Because both applicants are here for 2 and 3. And they're both
all right, let's take number 2.
Proposed to be continued.
Let's take number 2 first.
Okay.
Ms. Contreras, could you read that into the record?
Thank you. The following is a hearing on the request of Terry Horrigan to consider the following. 02 TRM 5 application filed on May 2nd, 2002, 06 RDN 04, application filed on February 24th, 2006. 01 RZN 3, application filed on November 9th, 2001. 04 DVP 27, application filed on June 15th, 2004. And 06 GOV 23, application filed on July 11th, 2006. And to approve the negative declaration 06 NGD 10 pursuant to the state guidelines for the implementation of CEQA.
All right, thank you very much. Any site visits or ex parte? Commissioner Brown?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I made multiple site visits, made four actually. Three of which I walked there because it's fairly near my home, and one I drove there.
All right.
And I've talked to Ms. Bridley recently. As a president of a neighborhood organization back when this first started back in 2002, I attended the first initial public meeting that Ms. Horrigan had with the neighbors. But basically, since that time, I've had no contact with the applicant other than recently with Ms. Bridley and during my site visit with Mrs. Horrigan as well.
All right, thank you. Anybody else? Commissioner Cooney?
I did visit the site, and I should comment, it was very helpful to have story poles erected, to say nothing of whether they were adequate to describe the project. Without them, it would have been very difficult to even see where particular proposed development was going to occur.
All right, thank you. And Commissioner Smizer?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I also visited the site.
Thank you. And I also visited the site. All right, with that, Ms. Gibbs?
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you. I don't think this is working. Okay. Staff and the applicant request that the item be dropped from the agenda today, primarily because, as you can see in the plans, lots 3 through 6 contain basements. The last BAR meeting was on the project was heard at July 15th, 2005. At that time, we were under the impression that the BAR had reviewed the current proposed plans, which contain the basements, and in fact, after re-examination, the plans that were reviewed by the BAR did not contain basements. So we would like to have the BAR review the plans and the current design at the next available meeting on September 15th, 2006.
So is the action to continue or to drop?
To drop the agenda,
To
please.
drop. All right, thank you. Council, should we have a public hearing open on this?
Mr. Chair, you should open the hearing to allow anyone who wishes to
All
speak
right.
to speak, but caution that there's going to be no
All right,
action at this
thank
time.
you. There isn't going to be any action by the Planning Commission. We're going to drop this item, but I'd like to open the public hearing if anybody wants to speak on this. Does anybody want to speak on this item? Seeing no one rise, we'll close the public hearing and we'll come back to the commission. All right, this is a second district item. Ms. Brown?
Then, Mr. Chair, I would like to make a motion to request to drop this agenda item.
All right, thank you. Do we have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Commissioner Boyson. Ms. Contreras, could you call the record, please?
Commissioner Boyson?
Aye.
Commissioner Brown?
Aye.
Commissioner Cooney?
Aye.
Commissioner Smizer?
Aye.
Commissioner Valencia?
Aye.
Vote carries 5-0.
All right, thank you. And that takes care of that. Let's go on to item number 3, the Ballantyne appeal. Ms. Contreras, could you read that into the record?
Thank you. The following is a hearing on the request of Peter Brown, attorney for the owner, Lynn Ballantyne, to consider the appeal 06 APL 19, appeal filed on June 23, 2006, of the Planning and Development Department's decision to deny a land use permit, case number 05 LUP 611.
All right, thank you. Any site visits or ex parte? I visited the site. All right. With that, we'll go to Mr. Bell.
Mr. Chair, Commissioners, this matter was scheduled to be heard today. However, on about a week and a half ago, the applicant's attorney, Peter Brown, who is present today, requested that the matter be continued. It's our understanding that the applicants are considering some changes to the plans to address staff's concerns. This is a case where staff did deny the land use permit for a proposed residence. Staff has reviewed the matter, and we recommend that the agenda item be dropped and then be rescheduled after we've had an opportunity to look at the revised plans and assess the time needed to revise our staff report and recommendations and bring the matter back to you. We do understand that Mr. Brown would like the matter continued or parked on the agenda, and you may wish to hear from him on that matter. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And before we open the public hearing, Mr. Brown, would you like to speak?
Thank you, Chair Valencia, members of the Commission. I'm Peter Brown. I represent the applicant, Lynn Ballantyne. As Alan stated, the applicant is doing some project revisions to address some of the issues that have been raised by staff. We believe they'll be ready in about 3 to 4 weeks to provide to staff for their review. The applicant, Ms. Ballantyne, has been in the process for some time. We would like to stay on the Planning Commission agenda just to ensure that the project keeps moving. My letter to Mr. Bell requested a continuance date of September 27th. We now believe that it probably should go a little bit later than that so that staff has adequate time to review. And our request would be that you set this item on October 4th or as soon thereafter as you can. We do understand that staff wants it to be dropped and then re-noticed. Our concern there is that if that doesn't occur until well into September, we may be looking at a November or December hearing date. And so my request, we want to keep the project moving. My request is that you set it for a date certain. If you don't do that, we would at least ask you to direct that it be parked on a early October date so that we don't have this long delay.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Brown.
Mr.
Yes,
Chair,
ma'am.
I think my recommendation would be to simply put it on the projection report for August or for October 4th. I do think that the item ought to be renoticed because members of the public did not come today. I think it's a hard expectation to have them follow that long into the future, and I think the plans may change a bit and should be redescribed. It wouldn't be renoticed.
Oh.
A continued item isn't renoticed. So my preference would be just to indicate your intention if it's ready to hear it on October 4th, put it on the Planning Commission projection report.
Does this project require an additional trip to the BAR, or is it not within the BAR jurisdiction?
Mr. Chair and Commissioner Cooney, the project has been reviewed by the BAR on an advisory basis only, so it's not required, although it's something I think the staff would intend to do.
Well, certainly if BAR is going to be involved, their schedule also has to be taken into account. I think the most we could do here is to indicate our desire to see it back as soon as it's possibly been reviewed by everybody that needs to, and if we want to park it and see if that's the right date down the line, that's okay with me.
Mr. Chair, just one other point. This is a land use permit on appeal. It's possible that the revised project is something that staff feels they can support, and if that's the case, it may not come to you at all.
Commissioner Smizer, this is a third district item. How do you feel about this? Drop or continue?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to kind of mention a preference of mine as an attorney and someone that comes before the court all the time asking and requesting time certain. I kind of feel for the applicant that it is more helpful in this particular case, I think, to have it parked. If it turns out that the matters are resolved and staff does not need to bring it to this commission, well, that'd be fine. So my preference would be to park it for the October 4th.
All right, fine. Do we have a motion to that? Excuse me, have to open the public hearing for this. Is there anybody who wants to speak on this item? Seeing no one rise, we'll close the public hearing and then we'll come back and we need a motion. Commissioner Smizer?
Mr. Chairman, I move that we that the commission park this agenda item of the Ballantyne appeal for October the 4th, that it be properly noticed to the community.
All right, thank you. Do we have a second?
Yes, I'll second, Mr.
Thank you, Commissioner Cooney. All right. Ms. Contreras, could you call the roll?
Commissioner Boyson,
Aye.
Commissioner Brown?
Aye.
Commissioner Cooney?
Yes.
Commissioner Smyser?
Yes.
Commissioner Valencia?
Aye.
Vote carries 5-0.
All right, very good. And now we'll get on to our first item. Are the planners here? Mr. Briggs, you're here? All right, we'll take a 2-minute break to set up. The Hira appeal. Ms. Contreras, could you please read that into the record?
Thank you. The following is a hearing on the request of Peter Swenson, appellant, to consider the appeal 06 APL 9, appeal filed on March 20th, 2006, of the Planning and Development Department's decision to approve case number 04 LUP 878.
All right, thank you. Any site visits or ex parte? Commissioner Boyson.
You know, I did visit the site, and I would just like to mention, too, that while I really do encourage staff, as far as brevity as staff reports, and more succinct the better as far as I'm concerned, but when we do have a case like this where it's a matter of mass, bulk, and scale, that we really do need to have some site plans and house descriptions when we go to the site. I received an email from Mr. Briggs when I called him on that, but I really think we need to have that as part of that.
Mr. Chair, Commissioners, thank you very much. I will make sure that our teams do that for you.
All right, thank you.
And I made a site visit, Mr. Chair.
All right, thank you. And Commissioner Cooney.
I did as well. I had a little trouble getting to the site, to the actual building site, but I at least got a general idea of where it's going to be.
And Commissioner Smyser.
Equally. I had a little trouble getting to the actual site, but I did get a general idea of what the site was.
And I visited all of the area. I don't know if I saw the site or not, but I know where the intersecting street is and all, and I looked at the sites. All right, and with that, Ms. Almy.
Thank you, Commissioners. Mr. Briggs will give the presentation.
Good morning, Chairman Valencia, members of the Commission. My name is Aaron Briggs, and I have a brief presentation for you today. I'll start with a quick background, move into the project description and consistency analysis, and conclude with our recommendation. The project site is located at 861 Via Chaparral, approximately 300 yards northwest of the intersection of Cathedral Oaks and Highway 154. The appellant's residence is located directly to the north of the Hira property. Please note the location of the Swenson residence in the western portion of their property and the location of the proposed Hira residence in the far eastern portion of his property. Here is a photo representing the view from the project site northwest toward the Swenson lot. As you can see, the Swenson residence is not visible from the building site due to extensive mature landscaping between the two lots. The Hira property is currently vacant. The proposed project is for a land use permit to authorize the construction of a new, approximately 3,800 square foot residence with a 410 square foot garage, a 540 square foot basement garage, and a 510 square foot basement utility storage room. The average height of the new residence would be approximately 24 feet. Access will be taken from a private driveway across Mr. Hira's developed lot from Via Chaparral. Here we have the site plan. You can see the residence there on the eastern portion of the property. In the middle, we have a drainage from Atascadero Creek, which has been set aside as a development exclusion zone. And then, so basically everything within the center and eastern portions of the lot are undevelopable. And now we have the elevations. This is the view from the north, south, west, and east. Staff concluded in its review that the project can be found consistent with the comprehensive plan, including the Goleta Community Plan, and the Article 3 zoning requirements, including height. The findings for neighborhood compatibility can be made, and the basic services are available to serve the project. The BAR reviewed the project on 4 separate occasions and granted final approval with the necessary findings of neighborhood compatibility on March 10th, 2006 by a 4-0 vote Although the residence would be larger than most of the existing residences in the immediate area, the BAR approved the project, citing its lack of visibility due to the extensive mature vegetation surrounding the subject lot and in the general neighborhood. A study of neighboring floor areas was presented to the BAR for its consideration. That information was included with the staff report as attachment F. Staff has now further refined this information. We looked at a total of 17 properties in the immediate area in order to develop the information as seen here. This slide shows the study area staff used to collect the data on the previous slide.
Where is Via Chaparral there?
It's to the east.
Oops, east. That's not Visual.
That's Paloma. So
It runs north-south, and it's to the east, parallel to 154.
it runs right, is it?
Oh, yeah.
Correct.
That's it, okay. So the lot is one block in.
It's an interior lot,
All right.
and the access is taken through Mr. Hira's other lot
Okay.
there.
Okay.
Exactly.
Please continue.
In summary, the project can be found consistent with the comprehensive plan, including the Goleta Community Plan, and the Article 3 zoning requirements, including height. Additionally, the project received final approval from the BAR, which made the necessary findings for neighborhood compatibility by a 4-0 vote. Staff's recommendation is to adopt the required findings for approval of case number 04 LUP 878, deny the appeal, case number 06 APL number 9, thereby upholding P&D's approval, and grant de novo approval of case number 04 LUP 878. That concludes staff's presentation, unless Ms. Almy has anything to add at this point.
All right, thank you very much. Bring it back to the commission. Ms. Brown, do you have something?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Do you have no sort of site plan information on your slide presentation that we could, because I have some questions about that. Where is the current house? I'm not sure that okay. So the proposed house is to the west.
Correct.
And is it, I drove into the Hira's driveway, and they probably thought I was some intruder going in there. But I didn't get out and look, but I looked at the general area. Is that lot is not flat, I can see, it's sloping, right?
Correct. It slopes down towards the center where we have that creek or
right.
area.
So this house, so what is the grade differential between this house and the existing house?
The elevation difference?
Yeah.
I would guess, and I don't have solid information here, but I would guess it's roughly equal. And I would think maybe the Swenson house may be a little bit higher than the proposed Hira house.
Mr. Chair, Commissioner, from my observation looking at the contours on this plan, it looks like the proposed Hira house is set down about 5 or so feet from the existing Hira house.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So the only views are from Mr. Swenson's, from those people living on Paloma who might, is that? And
Mr. Chair, Commissioner, that's correct. There are no public views of this lot, and there are
Right.
only private views from immediately surrounding neighbors.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Anything else? All right, with that, we'll open the public hearing. I'm sorry, we'll ask the applicant to come and speak. Ms. Weinheimer? The appellant, I'm sorry, the appellant.
The appellant first?
Yes. Peter Swenson, is that correct?
Yes, it is. Good morning.
Good morning.
So, as you know, I own the property on the northern boundary of the Hira project, proposed project. I'm here mainly for 2 reasons. One, the notification process was, I didn't find out about this going on until we saw the little placard sign in the front saying it's going to land use permit, and they have to have that up for 10 days. And we saw that, and so then we knew something was happening. Previously, I'd asked one of the county planners to notify me of something going on over there. And he said, okay, no problem. That's when they were going to do a guest house after the lot split. We didn't get any previous notification, so then I missed the ABR meeting. I just wanted to get a little input into them over the size. And so I had to spend $400 to come here today before you guys because I wasn't notified. And my main thing is people should be notified if they live right next door to the project, I believe. And I don't know if that's could be changed with the new head of the department. You know, maybe he'll change something. You have a new head, maybe you're running around with your head off. I don't know. It just doesn't seem very logical to me. And then the ABR says this is 3 times larger than anything else in the compatible area that they checked, and the garage is 2 times bigger. Well, I don't think it really fits in. I think the size is too much. I'm the one, I have one picture of the lot when it was being graded that I'd like you to see. They're saying the visibility isn't a problem, so that's why they okayed the large home. Well, I have visibility of it. It looks right down my valley view, right there in my face. If you can see from the slide that I have of the grading. And I guess the grading was done for the guest house, and now it's carried over into this project because the grading was already done. When the grading was done, when they got the lot split, they were supposed to have, if they do anything, have like a sediment fence, you know, when they do the grading. Well, they neglected doing that. They ran the tractors through the creek to get rid of the existing junk on the other side when they were getting granted the lot split. Anyway, my main thing is I think it's way too big for the neighborhood. It doesn't fit in. He already has the largest home in the neighborhood. Now it's going to be like the Twin Towers over there. That's my opinion. It's going to go from rural country cottage-size houses to this. Actually, it's about a 6,000 square foot thing. You guys don't count the basements. You don't count the garages. His current garage has never been used as a garage in the last 10 years. It's converted into living space. It has a little false front. He doesn't use it for a garage. So I'm kind of leery of the big garage on the main floor and the big garage down below and all that to be converted when you grant him all this space, and it's going to be converted. That's what I think. I wouldn't even be here today if I would have been able to go from the ABR, and it would have saved me $400. So that's all I have to say.
Questions? Just a second. Commissioner Brown has a question.
You know, Mr. Chair, I would like Ms. Meester to talk about the noticing because the county has recognized that there were a lot of deficiencies with noticing, and noticing has now changed. But I'd let Ms. Meester address the issues because there were many in the.
Look at the one picture that I brought.
Do you have it?
Oh, I'm sorry. Certainly.
I turned it in when I was supposed to with a little notice to speak.
Oh, okay.
It's a photo of when the grading was done.
Okay, so that
I'm looking over there, and I'm not supposed to be able to see this. It's supposed to be. It's like the fable with the king, you know, with the clothes business, you know. Oh, I don't see that, you know.
All right.
Mr. Chair.
So that's really all I have to say.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Swenson.
I wish I
Mr.
wouldn't.
Chair.
I'd
We'll
rather go to
give
the
you a
dentist than
chance
be
to
here.
rebut. We're going to let the applicant speak, and then I'm going to let you rebut after. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Mr.
Yes.
Chair, before you go to the applicant, if I can answer Commissioner Brown's question about noticing. We did recently, with the Planning Commission's blessing, change our noticing procedures for land use permits. And now, starting this, I think, March, land use permits are notices mailed to at least abutting property owners, if not property owners within 300 feet, depending on the type of development that's proposed. So in this particular case, if this application were filed today, adjoining property owners would receive mailed notice about it, as well as posted notice on the site, because we have recognized that posted notice is not as effective as a mailed notice. So that change is in effect.
And if I may, Mr. Chair, just to follow on, because the project had previously been to the BAR when noticing, well, there was no, this year noticing was initiated for projects going to the BAR, and this project was in, I guess, final approval, so that's noticing doesn't take place for that too. But also, for in a case like this, neighbors will be notified when projects go to BAR, in addition to.
Mr. Chair and Commissioner Brown, just to be very clear, the way our noticing procedures are written, the application, the development is noticed upon receipt by the county. We don't notice every step of the process, but we notice the initial application receipt. If we have a BAR date, we put that in the notice, and then it's the responsibility of an adjoining property owner to track that through the system. And they can do that either by calling the planner that's assigned to the case or tracking it in our permit tracking system that's available on the intranet.
Commissioner Boyson.
Yes, and as a follow-up to Mr. Swenson's picture, I'd just like to ask staff whether, and maybe it's in the staff report and I just don't remember seeing it, is this a permitted grading activity? And is staff aware that?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner, in fact, this project was subject to a lot split several years ago, and as a condition of the lot split, there was a requirement that the debris and detritus that was in the riparian corridor at that time needed to be removed, and so this grading was done in conjunction with that, and there was permit compliance observation over it as well.
And I apologize. I did not look at the correct site on this. I don't think the description was adequate in the staff report to allow that, and I just need to know, is that an accurate representation of what the site looks like today?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner, no, the site is recovered from the state.
It has. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Ms. Weinheimer?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the Commission. My name is Kathleen Weinheimer. I've represented the Hira family for a number of years in connection with their lot split and with the most recent application that's the subject of this appeal. As Ms. Olney indicated, there was a condition on the prior lot split application that did require the removal of considerable debris material that did take place some years ago. But since that time, as I think some of the more recent photographs can show, and I have a couple that I think are the same as those the planner included in his report, show that the site really has recovered from the debris removal portions that were undertaken. With that, I'd like to turn to the questions before you today on this particular application, and our reasons for attending are simply to support the staff report. We believe that the BAR made appropriate findings, that the size, bulk, and scale of this project are appropriate given the considerable size of the lot, the large portion of the lot which is set aside as permanent open space due to the riparian corridor and the environmentally sensitive areas, as well as the size of some of the adjacent properties that are not included in the exhibit that was attached to or provided by the appellant. In my submittal, I included yet a different set of properties for your comparison. The last page of my submittal shows a variety of homes on La Paloma, Villa Chaparral, and Meadowlark that are on larger parcels, and many of which are of comparable or indeed larger sizes than that proposed by Mr. and Mrs. Hira. I think those are more in keeping with what the BAR was looking at, because it doesn't seem appropriate to make a comparison with a house that's on an 8,000 square foot lot compared to a house that's on a 1.54 acre site. With that, one of the neighbors is here to support the project as well. Mr. and Mrs. Hira are here and are happy to answer any questions. As I say, we've spent a long time with this project and are very hopeful that we will have your support today.
All right, thank you very much, Ms. Weinheimer. Any questions? All right, at not, we'll open the public hearing. Commissioner Cooney, did you have a question?
I did think of one for Ms. Weinheimer. You, with your submittal, had, which I think was helpful, comments from neighbors regarding the particular project, but then you also circulated and submitted petitions from people as far away as western Goleta, and I didn't see the relevance of that. I know you to be an excellent attorney, so maybe you can explain why those particular items were included.
Mr. Chair, in response to Mr. Cooney, I too wanted to distinguish between the letters from the neighbors who are in the vicinity and those people who signed the petition who are merely supporters of Mr. Hirres and appreciate the quality of the work that he's done on his own home and feel that they wanted to lend their support to this second project of his. I hope I in no way tried to suggest that they were affected property owners. They are merely supporters of the Hira family.
And I don't mean to suggest you were misleading the commission in any way. You made it clear that was the case. I just didn't see the direct relevance of those comments to this particular project.
No, I think they are offered solely as members of the public who are supportive of this application.
All right, thank you very much. At this time, we'll open the public hearing. Mr. Bart LaGreca.
Good morning. I'm Bart LaGreca. I'm Jack's next door neighbor. I've known him for a good many years. He's a wonderful person, wonderful family. I approve of this single home, and that's all I can say.
All right. Do you live, as we look at the property, to the right? Do you live right on Chaparral?
Yes. I'm on front of my house is on La Paloma.
Oh,
the back of my house.
Okay, I got it.
All I have to walk is down the end of my property.
And you're in his property.
And he's got a gate there where I can open and visit with him.
Okay.
That's how close we are.
All right, thank you very much. Any questions?
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Is there anybody else who'd like to speak? If not, we'll close the public hearing, and Mr. Swenson, you get a chance to rebut. Would you like to rebut anything that's been testified to?
Just one thing, Amy's statement about the recovery of the.
Could you speak into the mic?
The recovery of the grading.
Mm-hmm.
It just has weeds on it now, but it's the same as in my picture. It just has some weeds on it. That's
all.
She said it's different. I don't know.
All right, thank you. All right, yes?
Mr. Chair, if it would help your commission, we do have a number of photographs of the site that we can show you, and we also have a number of photographs of homes in the surrounding area that we can show you as well.
I think that would be appropriate.
And do you have site plans that we could look at, or did you bring them with you? That would be really helpful too. We could take a break and look. Thank you. Okay.
All right, go ahead and show the pictures now, and then we'll.
These are pictures of houses on La Paloma. This is actually a smaller lot. There are I think 4 smaller lots in this neighborhood, and this is 1/5 of an acre, where the normal house size in this neighborhood is 1 acre. It's another home on 1/5 of an acre. It's a more typical shot of the neighborhood. Open spaces, what I would describe as residential agriculture, people keeping horses, small orchards, that type of thing. Here's another typical lot, 2 homes on 1 lot. This home, I believe, is right next door to Mr. Swenson's. This is the larger area. You can see the proposed lot there is in red. Yeah. And here are some pictures of the site. This is standing on the building pad looking to the southwest. Backed up a little bit, again looking to the southwest and down into the drainage. You can see the pepper trees there. This is a shot looking northwest towards the Swenson lot. And I think that's all we have.
And at the end of the drive, there's a gated community or house. What is that at the end of the Chaparral? I don't think you got to it, but as you drive at the end of Chaparral to the left, there's a gated.
This one?
Yes. What is?
That's the Shadow Hills condominiums, I believe.
Oh, all right. All right. Thank you. All right. We'll bring it. Commissioner Brown.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Do you have any history of how this neighborhood was developed? I mean, it's a little bit of everything, it seems like. Can you just give me some idea about that?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner, this neighborhood is a neighborhood in transition. There were a lot of homes that were built in the 50s, I believe, around here. I think this neighborhood was affected by the Painted Cave fire as well. There are a number of rebuilds in this area as well. It wasn't totally wiped out like the San Antonio Creek neighborhood, but I think that's about as specific as I can get.
But some of these lots are smaller, so that must have been as a result of lot of lot splits, and some just didn't get split, and so we ended up. So it's just sort of a mix.
Right now, yes, I believe that's the case. Like I said, in transition, probably.
Commissioner Boyson.
I guess my question is of council. Are we limited to the items that are brought up in the appeal to bring up at this hearing?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Boyes, and members of the Commission, it's a de novo hearing. You must make the findings de novo, and so your review is as broad as the rather limited findings for an appeal of a land use permit.
I guess my question on this has to do with I noticed that this is on a private septic system. I was under the impression that the sewer is actually along Via Chaparral, isn't it? I remember when we were talking about the Rancho San Marcos that they were talking of having to come across whatever the bridge there is, Via Cayetana or whatever.
Mr. Chair, Commissioner, that's a very good point. A lot of this area remains on septic, and when the application for the parcel map was reviewed, that the subject of sewage disposal was discussed and decided upon, and septic was.
And I assume that environmental
health had reviewed that,
reviewed this and bought off on
yes,
this,
sir.
and decided that the perks were up. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. We'll bring it back to. You have any other comments? We'll bring it back to the Planning Commission. What's the wishes? This is a second district.
Yeah. Mr. Chair, what I'd like to do and afford the commissioners the opportunity, if they so wish, because we've already had one commissioner who's indicated he'd like to see it, and I'd like to see it, is the site plans and other information. If we could take a very short break, if that would be
We'll take
acceptable.
a short 3-minute break and bring the plans up.
Thank you.
Planning Commission come back to order. We're still on item number 1, and we were looking at the maps during the break. Ms. Brown.
Mr. Chair, what I'd like to do is just, as we normally do, is hear from my fellow commissioners. Perhaps if there's any more questions, first, before we do that, perhaps Ms. Almy has some further comments based upon our review of the site plans.
Mr. Chair, Commissioners, first and foremost, I want to let you know that in the future you will be getting full-size plans on all of these projects, and I apologize. I should have caught that. Secondly, I wanted to point out something that we didn't talk about during the presentation, which is the landscape plan. We've posted it up. It's in color up there, and you can see that there are screened plantings along the north along the side that is adjacent, or the northwestern property line adjacent to where the appellants live, for additional screening. And if you would like an explanation of this, we can ask Mr. Hero to come up. But it is an interior lot. It is, you can see, fully landscaped. in the area that it's allowed to, that where development is allowed to encroach. You know, the majority of the slot will remain as an open space area and a development exclusion area.
All right, Commissioner Boyson.
Well, I just asked maybe Ms. Almay, could you remind us all, what is the county's procedure as far as the protection of private view sheds?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner, thank you very much. This area of the county is covered by the comprehensive plan and the policies contained in the comprehensive plan, and there are no policies that pertain to protection of private views in the comprehensive plan. There are policies in the Montecito Community Plan that require consideration of private views. Under CEQA, we are enjoined to consider private views in our analyses. However, this land use permit is statutorily exempt from CEQA. So in sum, there are no policies in place protecting private views.
All right, thank you. Anybody else like to comment? Commissioner Cooney.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think we have a narrow question before us. This is not the lot split which occurred several years ago, and obviously the commissioners at that time or the decision makers took into account the environmental issues, particularly the location of the creek. There was a development envelope created. So what we're really doing at this point is reviewing the structure to be created within that development envelope. And it is not so much an environmental issue as it is purely an aesthetic issue. And it's an aesthetic issue raised typically at the Board of Architectural Review for those projects subject to it. I think it's unfortunate and perhaps unfair to Mr. Swenson and his neighbors that there wasn't sufficient notice to allow them to appear at the appropriate forum, which really is the design development stage. Having said that, I think that his comments regarding the size would probably not have changed the design too much, if at all, because while it is a larger home compared to some in the neighborhood, it is not large by the standards of new construction that we've been reviewing over the last 2 years. This house perhaps is on the larger side for the neighborhood at this point, but I predict it will not be large in relation to homes constructed in not only the immediate but the surrounding neighborhood in the years to come. This is the trend, and the key is how well designed are these homes? It's not just a pure matter of square footage, but does it fit the site? Does it fit in with the chaparral, the slope of the hill, those kinds of things which the BAR reviewed on 3 different occasions and eventually approved. So I'm constrained by these limitations to approve an appeal of this project, and I feel in this transition neighborhood it's larger but not too large, so I would deny the appeal.
Thank you. Anybody else? Looking at the site, 1.5 acres is about 65,000 square feet. Normally in a 7,000 square foot house, 7,000 square foot lot, we get about a 2,000 to 2,500 square foot house. So this is double that amount, say 14,000 square feet. He's got 65,000 square feet. He's got more than enough space, and I don't see a problem. The format of the houses in the general area, the theme, seems to be quite eclectic, and so I think it's a good addition to the neighborhood, so I don't have a problem with it. And I would have to deny the appeal. Commissioner Brown.
Okay, if I've heard from all my fellow commissioners, I will sum up my comments. I think it would have been helpful to, as Ms. Meester had indicated, if noticing procedures that the county adopted and put in place this year had been in place last year. But unfortunately it isn't, but for those going forward, the noticing will be most beneficial to neighbors and neighborhoods. I think Commissioner Boyson got to one of the key issues, that the county doesn't protect private views or view sheds in this area, and I don't believe that in looking in the area that there's no public view sheds involved. You can't sort of see this project from, I'm not sure where you would see it, perhaps through binoculars, but I don't think that you can see it from any nearby public roadways. Ms. Almy indicated that it is an interior lot. It's going to be on the western side of the present house, and I doubt that you're going to see it except from those homes that are to the north and northeast and northwest up on the top of the hill off of La Paloma. For me, the issues, because I've been deeply involved in the writing, helping to write and participating in the residential design guidelines, the key issues here are for me the compatibility issues. And because it is a mixed neighborhood, this is why I asked you the question about sort of the evolution of the neighborhood. It is very eclectic. There's a little bit of everything. So really making compatibility determinations is kind of hard, because you're not really comparing this house to others on La Paloma. You're really almost comparing it to the house itself, to its neighboring house. So I believe that I will be supporting the staff recommendations, and unless I hear from any other commissioners, what I'd like to do is to adopt the required findings for approval of case number 04 LUP string 0000878 included as attachment A of the staff report, deny the appeal, case number 06 APL string 009, thereby upholding planning and development's approval, and grant de novo approval of land use permit case number 04 LUP string 878 included as attachment B of this staff report.
Thank you, Commissioner Brown. Do we have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Commissioner Boyson. Any further comment? Ms. Contreras, could you call the record?
Commissioner Boyson?
Aye.
Commissioner Brown?
Aye.
Commissioner Cooney?
Aye.
Commissioner Smizer?
Aye.
Commissioner Valencia?
Aye.
Vote carries 5-0.
Motion carries. All right, thank you. We'll take a short break while we set up for the next item.
Mr. Chair, I think we're going to go to item number 4, which is the zoning enforcement recommendations, and I'll ask the clerk to read that into the record so that we can continue that to September 7th.
Ms. Contreras, would you please read that into the record?
Thank you. The County Planning Commission will participate in a workshop to review and provide direction to staff on proposed revisions to the zoning violation abatement process as implemented through Article 3 Inland Zoning Ordinance.
Mr. Chair, as I indicated this morning when I went over the agenda status, we are actually ready to move from workshop to ordinance adoption, and the planner didn't change the language on the agenda or the notice, so we need to continue this. And my suggestion is we continue it to September 7th, which is a special hearing with the Montecito Planning Commission on the zoning ordinance reformatting project. We'll let the Montecito Planning Commission go and then take this matter up.
All right, and you want to continue it rather than drop it?
Actually, it needs to be dropped. I just wanted you to know when we're going to actually bring it back.
Okay, could we don't need to open the public hearing on this, do we?
You probably technically should.
All right, let's open it.
But I don't think
we'll
there's
open the
anybody
public hearing. Is there anybody here who wishes to speak on this before we move to drop it? Seeing no one rise, we'll bring it back. Okay, we need a motion to drop this item.
Mr. Chair, I'll make a motion to drop the item from the agenda.
Thank you, Commissioner Brown. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Thank you, Commissioner Boyson. Ms. Contreras, could you call the roll?
Commissioner Boyson?
Aye.
Commissioner Brown?
Aye.
Commissioner Cooney?
Aye.
Commissioner Smizer?
Yes.
Commissioner Valencia?
Aye.
Vote carries 5-0.
All right, thank you. And with that, we'll go on to item number 5. Would you please read that into the record?
Thank you. The County Planning Commission will participate in a workshop to review proposed revisions to urban oak tree interpretive guidelines.
All right, thank you. Ms. Meester?
Mr. Chair, members of the Commission, I'll start this item just to try and provide a little bit of historic context, and then I believe Ms. Perez is going to present the Community Planning Renaissance's recommendation and purpose for this item, and then Ms. Saley will go through a little bit more detail in what we're proposing. As your Planning Commission is aware, the department's been involved in process improvement efforts since about 2003. And at about that same time, actually maybe a little bit before, the Community Planning Renaissance formed to offer to be partners with the department to work on a number of issues that they had identified as important to the community, mainly the development community and property owners in the area. So the CPR is made up of a number of representatives of developers, architects, landscape architects, attorneys, and the like. Back in 2003, they identified 5 issues that they felt would go a long way toward improving the development review process and making it more predictable, smoother, and easier for somebody to navigate, just making sure that the rules are really understood and were clear. And one of those was oak tree guidelines. As you can see attached to the staff report, there are a number of policies in the county's LCP, the comprehensive plan, and the various community plans that address oak tree and tree protection. And what we're trying to do is to refine the guidelines that we use, the department uses, to determine whether or not a project is consistent with these policies. So it's essentially a methodology. And what we're proposing today is to go back somewhat to the methodology that we used to use in the department, and that is the drip line plus actually 5 feet is recommended methodology for the potential disturbance area rather than continuing on with the critical root zone. The department switched to that a couple of years ago, attempted to bring those revised guidelines to the Board of Supervisors, and for a variety of reasons, the board was not interested in taking that matter up at that time. We restructured the way we were doing process improvement. Nonetheless, the Community Planning Renaissance Group continues to feel it's important for the community as a whole to understand that the department and the county are willing to look at oak trees in a sensible way, to allow for people to design with their oak trees instead of encouraging them to remove them. So I guess the most important things for me to say are, number one, we're not changing the rules. We're really trying to make it clear how we look at the rules that exist in all of our planning documents now. Number two, this has nothing to do with the rural oak tree ordinance. So I think that's really important. This is urban oak trees in the context of ministerial permits. Number three, we're not proposing to adopt an ordinance, so we're not changing the regulatory structure. We're just trying to provide some guidance to the public and to the planners as to how these policies will be interpreted into the future.
So right now we have 8 plans that have
Right.
development standards and biological items,
Right.
policy items on them.
Right.
They're not going to be consolidated or anything.
Not-
It's just going to be another index item, how to use them.
Right. It's really, how do you determine whether or not an oak tree is potentially impacted, and what do you do when it is, and what can occur in the tree protection area, which Laurel and Pat Saley will go through in a bit more detail. But I just thought it was really important. This has nothing to do with the rural oak tree ordinance. So that's a deal breaker. We're not touching that, nor do we have any intention to. This is really for development review in the urban area to implement existing policies. It's not intended to be more strict or less strict, but just clearer so that people understand that their oak trees are really important assets to their property and not liabilities. So what I'd like to do is to turn this over to Laurel, and she can give you her perspective and CPR's perspective on what we're proposing, and then Pat will run through the provisions in a bit more detail.
Thank you. I'm Laurel Fisher-Perez, and today representing Community Planning Renaissance. With me here is Bob Easton, an architect. Oftentimes with me is Susan Van Atta, a landscape architect. She's unable to make it at this time because she has a meeting, so apologize for that. But one point of clarification, CPR is a group of professionals who work in the users of the system, if you will, of the planning department. There aren't any developers involved with CPR, although many of us represent developers, as you all know. But it's a group made up of architects, landscape architects, planning consultants as myself. There are some land use attorneys involved and engineers. And we're here on this topic today because we care about our community's trees. We're here because we have witnessed behind the scenes the loss of trees, in particular oak trees. And our focus today is oak trees. Questions came up at the Montecito Planning Commission about other specimen trees, and there are policies in the community plans in place to protect specimen trees, but we focused on oak trees because those are the trees that we've been seeing a loss of, unfortunately, before applications are filed with the county. We are also finding that property owners and applicants are not willing to plant new oak trees on their properties because they then become a restriction on their properties for future flexibility or improvements. And I think that largely the reason why people are fearful of filing applications that propose development near or within a tree protection zone is because the way that the county P&D is going to handle that request once it comes in for review is unclear. And we have policies in place that say protect those trees to the maximum extent feasible. And judgment comes into play in that review as to what is reasonable development within that area. And applicants are fearful of that. They don't know what that means. And what complicated this whole issue about 4 or 5 years ago, maybe longer, is when the critical root zone method for determining that tree protection zone was introduced and replaced what had been in practice for many, many years, which was the tree protection zone based on a drip line. And those of you who have used critical root zone understand that it involves a mathematical calculation, oftentimes which is unclear to property owners and their agents as to how to identify that zone. We've got a few exhibits here that demonstrate that in some cases on large oak trees you end up with a tree protection zone that is really nonsensical. It's in, I don't know if you have that PowerPoint still, Pat, but we can look at that later if there are any questions. We also were finding that it didn't provide adequate protection on oblong-shaped canopies. So, and we can get into those details if you have questions, but the biggest issue was uncertainty. And what became very clear is that when property owners can walk out onto their property and clearly identify and see for themselves what that tree protection zone is, utilizing a drip line plus a 5-foot calculation, you have certainty and you have a little bit less fear on that particular aspect. The second thing that we want to address is what can happen within that tree protection zone. And what needs to be provided to inform the review, to inform P&D's review when a project is proposed within that tree protection zone. And so what we're trying to accomplish now is clarity in the system. If you encroach within that tree protection zone based on drip line plus 5 feet, you must provide an arborist report, and it must contain the required elements to educate that review, particularly construction measures that shall be in place to protect that tree during construction, and mitigation where appropriate. But the message to the property owner must be clear and simple. You can propose projects within these tree protection zones. This tree, don't burden this poor tree with the responsibility of determining whether or not development is reasonable, because when you do that, that tree's gone before that application comes in. People don't want to risk the fact that their bedroom addition or their breakfast nook or their home can't incorporate and embrace the trees on their property. And what we know to be true is that property owners love their trees. They don't want to get rid of them. They also want to construct their dream home or their improvement that could embrace and incorporate that tree. And what we find based on many examples in this community, in this town, you go up to the Natural History Museum as a perfect example, is that development and improvements can occur and can coexist right up next to oak trees and incorporate those trees. And many times when trees are incorporated into the design, those trees thrive because property owners want them to stay as part of the design of that home or improvement. And so I think our objective, and Bob's going to take this over after my long-winded speech, is really to clarify the tree protection zone so everybody understands what that zone is. Secondly, to get the message out there that with proper mitigation and construction methods, improvements may occur and incorporate trees. And then thirdly, what we can help the department with is an education effort, getting the word out to property owners and their agents, including people such as myself and architects and landscape architects and realtors, that don't worry, you know, the planning department is working with you. You don't need to take those trees down before you file your application. A commissioner was concerned that we might be letting the cat out of the bag on this, and now people will start doing that. It's been happening for a long time now. It is a problem, and we want to put an end to it, and we want to make sure that reasonable development can happen and can incorporate those trees, and we don't need to be fearful of that process, and that those development proposals will be reviewed with reason and concern, and it's all about protecting those trees and allowing property owners to continue with their projects so that those trees are no longer jeopardized. So that's why we're here, and we put together a simplified version of tree protection paper. I hope you've had a chance to look at your staff report. By the way, I think staff did a really excellent job summarizing our points and objectives, and we have reviewed this with the Montecito Planning Commissioners. I think it was last week, and they largely agreed with this effort and recognized that there is a problem out there, and we firmly believe that going back to the drip line plus 5 feet is the clearest and a measure that will help to realize the success of this effort and hopefully save our trees.
All right, thank you.
I'm Bob Easton, and as a practicing architect in this community, I have heard of many examples of people know that they can clear trees off their property before they file, and it's not illegal to do so. And realtors and other people tell people that they can do that, and they will be ahead of the game if they do that because they won't be restricted about developing their property. And we want to put an end to that. And Laurel did a great job of describing our overall position. And Pat has done a great job of researching what other communities in the area, other comparable communities, have in the way of tree protection information. And she's studied it quite well, and many communities are using the drip line plus 5 feet. Plus, she's talked to some consultants about this, and the critical root zone that has come into favor in certain areas is a very complex methodology. And what we want to do, our goal is to establish a tree protection, I don't know exactly how to say it, but the word out to everybody in the community so they know if they want to develop property, they don't have to cut their trees, that the county planning department will be able to work with them with these new guidelines. And part of these guidelines is to have a tree protection form that they would fill out, which would standardize the work that an arborist would do in analyzing the impact on trees or non-impact on trees. And that would be very understandable. People could figure it out. There'd be no complex mathematics behind that particular system. However, also would be information in there in this form that would be available to everybody about how to protect their oak trees, what are the best conditions to preserve the oak trees, and to let people know that the oak trees have a tremendous value for their property. And an arborist would be encouraged, the arborist doing this analysis would be encouraged to value the oak trees and put a dollar value on them. That's done in other communities, and it seems to work very well in informing people of how valuable those trees are. And then to also present methodology, how to work with constructing near and around oak trees if necessary. And Pat will go into the details of how that form and how those new guidelines would be. But I think this is very important, that what we're trying to do. We're trying to save trees. We're not trying to make it easier for people to go in and ruin their trees. We're trying to make it easy for them to work with ways to preserve their oak trees. And any questions, we'd be happy to answer.
Commissioner Brown has one.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I always appreciate Mrs. Perez's articulate presentations, and nice to see you here, Mr. Easton. But I have some just basic questions. Based upon my experience, which is I live in the 2nd District, which is very limited, we have 2 projects there, both of which are embracing oak trees. There doesn't seem to be any problems with the applicants wanting to do away with the oaks or cut the canopy of oak trees to reduce strip lines or anything, and we're using the critical root zone. I believe both of them are. But you know, you indicated that the critical root zone is a complicated mathematical calculation, and is it not just defined as a circular area around a tree trunk with a radius equivalent to 1 foot of each inch of diameter at breast height?
That is true. However, many oak trees are multiple trunk trees.
Right.
And that adds a confusing factor. And the fact that the drip lines or the shape of the trees are not just nice, simple, round shapes either. Also, on hillsides, the root patterns are different. So those are 3 quick complexities to the critical root zone that tend to confuse people.
Okay, and also older trees have probably much larger root areas that critical root zone would be more protective of than the drip line. Is that not also the case?
Well, I don't know about that. It would depend on the slope. It would depend on the soil conditions. Younger trees certainly are more able to adapt to different conditions. However, certainly in any system, there's going to be some risk. There's a risk in the critical root zone that people don't interpret it properly and they don't get it to work right. What we want to do is come up with a system that has, say, a more or a better percentage for success that people can understand and apply. And certainly we're not talking about big developments here. Somebody going in for a discretionary kind of permit would be subject to the trees would be subject to more analysis perhaps, but we're talking about individuals and single-family resident property owners and things like that.
I'm not really, I am familiar with CPR, but is most of their work in the Santa Barbara rather than in the Goleta area? It's mostly Montecito area. Would that be correct?
Not exactly.
No?
It was, so we formed CPR years ago because we felt that something had to be done to improve customer service and basic common sense in interpreting ordinances at the county. And it was formed initially by a group of us architects, and we brought in land planners, and we brought in contractors and other people in the community, and held a number of meetings to try to find out if there was a community feeling and a community support to encourage the planning department to take a look at their processes and policies. And there were quite a few people that did show up for these meetings and express their feelings quite dramatically. And I think that that's what led eventually to the PIT process and our ongoing basis here to try to work with some of the issues that we felt were important. And basically it's the architects were located in Santa Barbara area, and few in Montecito, but mainly in Santa Barbara.
So it's not really, there's nobody participating from the North County in your group?
Not that I know of.
Okay. All right, thank you.
That'd be nice if we could build that kind of eventual.
All right, thank you.
Mr. Easton, I have a question. As a general rule, sometimes it's difficult to keep up with all the rules and development standards. But if somebody asks, if you look at a big oak tree and you look at the the circular head of it and you look straight down, that's the drip line. If you extend that line out 5 feet all the way around 360, that includes the protection of the root zone, in general terms?
General terms.
Yeah, I know.
Commissioner Valencia, and also to address Commissioner Brown's earlier question, that's correct. That is the method, and I want to start this. And we may get some advice on this, hopefully. I don't know that there's any one particular tree protection zone identification method that's perfect. You know, I think that there are probably problems with any one method that you select. What we're trying to achieve here is one that is most easily understood and has the greatest chance of being implemented to protect that tree and doesn't put that tree in undue risk. And so one of the things I wanted to share with you, and maybe if we could get the lights, Terry, that would be helpful. I just have 2 simple PowerPoint slides here. This is a project that we worked on a while ago, and it happens to be out in Montecito, which is a place that we often, this is an effort that's geared toward our urban oak trees. So Montecito is a common place to see this method employed. This is the county's current practice of employing the critical root zone. And our project is down here in this area here. It happens to be in a mechanical equipment enclosure, and I think we had a fountain. We mapped the critical root zones of all trees in this area. And in fact, the critical root zone that affected the project, as you can see here, is from a tree, a large, very large oak tree that is practically on the other side of this existing residence. And that is the one that affected, in terms of location, the proposed project. We also mapped the critical root zones of the oak trees that were nearest to the project, and because of their trunk size, those protection zones didn't come anywhere as close to the proposed project as the one that was furthest away. So this is an example of some of the things that we were running into in utilizing the critical root zone. We also mapped the drip line of those oak trees and then added 6 feet to those drip lines. And then you see a more logical, I think, approach in identifying potential impacts to the trees that are nearest to the construction site. You see the drip lines there in yellow, and then we added a 6-foot buffer, and in fact, a portion of this project encroached within that tree protection zone. But on this particular case, utilizing the drip line plus a certain amount of buffer from that drip line made most sense when trying to assess the potential impacts of this project on the trees that were closest to it.
What happens if you cut some of the roots that are approaching too close to a house? In this instance, like this, that one right there, the root, say, started coming in here. Do you hurt the tree if you cut the root that comes way out of the drip line?
Commissioner Valencia, I'm not an arborist or a biologist, but what we're talking about is if you are proposing a project that is within the tree protection zone area, it is all done within the context of a proper tree protection report that would include appropriate mitigation and construction methods to preserve and protect and help save that tree.
Mm-hmm. There's a gentleman in the audience that seems he has the answer to that.
Okay.
Would you come up to the microphone and identify yourself? And
well, I'm not part of CPR. My name is Ken Knight. I'm a professional arborist, certified arborist, urban forester. I also happen to be the executive director of Goleta Valley Beautiful. I'm not there in this capacity at this point. I'm on the list of the county's consultants that you call as an expert as to preparing these plans. And I'm one of the people that would prepare these plans, so that once you say there's an impact to the tree, I go out and take a look at it. Your first question was
the root?
When you cut the roots.
Yes.
Trees are kind of like people. The older they get crankier. If you get a really old, mature tree and you cut its roots, it gets really cranky, and sometimes it can get diseased. If you handle it appropriately, you can reduce the amount of impact. There is always a risk anytime that you cut a tree because trees don't respond like humans. They don't heal. The structure of a tree is they seal off an area where potential germs and infection can get into it. So if you cut a tree, that allows infection to get in. And if you cut it in the right way, you can reduce the possibility that future damage could occur. And it depends upon the size of the root, where it's located, and how you treat it.
Occasionally people, the time that when they cut the roots is when the roots seem to be coming up on top of their lawns or something after they've been and it's a well established, and all of a sudden here comes this thick root up on top. Is that and so that's what I've heard complaints about that.
That can happen. I think we're talking about the impact of development, though, and the distance away, and logic versus science.
Does that hurt the tree when they?
Absolutely. Every time you cut a tree, you increase the possibility of something happening to that tree. Okay. But there are ways of making those cuts in such a way that you can minimize the potential danger to the tree. So it's possible to make the cuts.
Okay. Any other questions from members of the commission? Commissioner Smizer? No. All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Knight.
I have a few comments later,
right.
So when you're ready for public comment.
All right. Thank you. Ms. Perez, please continue. Is that?
Chairman Valencia, I believe we're here for questions, should you have any.
All
Otherwise,
right.
we're done.
Bring it back to staff. Staff have any questions?
Mr. Chair, we were just going to run through a few slides just to sort of lay this out in a maybe just a little bit more systematic way, but we won't spend a lot of time on it. And then
all right.
Happy to hear from the commission and Mr. Knight.
I think in this case we're happy to hear from you because we're learning something here.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission. I'd like to run through a few slides. As Ms. Meester said, she mentioned briefly existing county policies regarding oaks. There are many policy documents. There are quite a few. I think you said 8 total. Also, in terms of ordinances, there is only one on the books, and that is in the coastal zone for tree removal. Generally, Article 2, the coastal zone, any development that might impact an oak requires a coastal development permit. We are talking about the Article 3 urban areas today. As was mentioned, when we started talking to the CPR committee, one of the first things we always do in this instance is, in addition to looking back on the previous pit work, we also did a lot of research about how other communities handle oak trees, and we divided that into counties and cities. Cities traditionally are more stringent when they view things like their urban forest. There were quite a few counties, a little surprising, that have nothing that we were able to find. San Diego, Napa, Orange County had nothing, but Ventura, San Luis, quite a few other counties did, and we've presented that in that table. Also, we looked at some cities. Even since we've done that table, we looked to see if Santa Maria, Buellton, or Solvang had any ordinances or guidelines relating to oaks. And, you know, it's not perfect when you're doing an internet search, but we didn't find anything in those communities, just as information. Well, that I figured you would know, if Solvang in particular, but maybe when I'm done, if you could add, I'd appreciate that. The proposed guidelines, the idea is we try to keep them as short and sweet as possible, not voluminous guidelines. Use illustrations, that always helps, but keep them pretty succinct. They would apply, as currently outlined, to coast live oaks, valley and blue oaks, and then other native trees, and that's something we'll be talking about in a moment. They would not be applicable to dead or damaged trees. And then something we'd like your input on is a provision that the Oversight Committee inserted 2 meetings ago relating to trees that the owners planted, oak trees, for example, planted in the recent past that have nothing to do with mitigation for any other oak damage. This is a provision that was in the Santa Clarita City ordinance relating to oaks. I think it's something that needs some more discussion, because the idea is that if an owner can document that they planted this 5-gallon or 24-inch box or whatever oak tree, then it would not be subject to future mitigation. But from a sort of logistical standpoint, that sounds a little complicated, and we'd like to hear your input. The common trees that we've been talking about, oaks, as I mentioned, sycamores, willows, bay laurel, cottonwoods. Two important things, though. Since the staff report was written, we've went to both the Oversight Committee last Thursday, the Montecito Planning Commission last Wednesday, and they went kind of in different directions. The Montecito Planning Commission felt that these guidelines should also discuss specimen trees, which in Montecito, for example, are quite a major feature. Several of the community plans speak to specimen trees. Some of them talk about 24-inch diameter, things like that. Some of them just say, save specimen trees, pretty nonspecific. Others are silent on the matter. So our job is to bring that forward and discuss with you. The Oversight Committee last Thursday went in the other direction. They felt that, you know, the issue here is oaks. Let's just talk about oaks and see how this goes with oaks. Those are the trees you hear about people cutting down, not sycamores, not cottonwoods. Let's just focus on oaks. So we would like to hear your thoughts on that as well. Here's a section, more or less, of or side view of an oak showing the drip line plus 5 feet. And the county previously, the standard condition when an oak tree construction was going to occur near an oak tree was drip line plus 6 feet. We've recommended 5 feet primarily because that seems to be the standard. When we did our research, virtually, well, not a good number of counties use drip line plus 5 feet, and for consistency's sake, is our suggestion. 6 feet could also be used. The reports, they would be required any development within the tree protection zone, the drip line plus 5 feet. And there are times where that just can't be avoided. A sewer line, for example, traditionally you don't want any more turns in a sewer line than you can avoid. Sometimes that might necessitate going under a oak tree. We're not saying that cannot be done. We're saying if that's the case, a tree protection plan needs to be prepared. In many of those communities, the tree protection plan, the trigger is the discretion of the director, and that's one of the things we're trying to stay away from. That's very subjective and ambiguous. We're trying to be very clear. The report would include impacts, if replacement plantings are necessary, size, an appraisal. This was a new one to us. But the reasoning, and I believe Laurel or Bob mentioned this, is by placing a value on a tree, experience has shown that contractors and developers treat that tree with a lot more respect. They understand that it's an asset that has value. And if replacement is required, it gives a clue as to what the value of the replacement tree, if bonding is required, it gives you a place to start. So that is something we're suggesting be included. Maintenance, clearly, typically for a 3-year period, some maintenance program is laid out. The tree protection reports would have a hierarchy, just as they do today. This is no change from what is in existing county policies and sort of draft guidelines. Ideally, you avoid impacting within the tree protection zone. If there is no alternative, you minimize. Then relocation, this has been done successfully. It tends to be very expensive. It's not anyone's first choice, but it can be done. Removal and then replacement. The guidelines, as I said, would be short and sweet as much as they can be, with attachments to help people if they need it. We've also talked about informational brochures, the kind of thing that would be available at the public counter. Just educating people about you don't plant lawn, whether or not they have any development planned. You don't plant lawn under an oak, you don't water under an oak. Things that in the long term can really cause the tree to suffer. And then finally, as I mentioned, last Wednesday, the Montecito PC, they were supportive of the intent and the general direction. They wanted to include specimen trees. And the Oversight Committee, a day later, suggested that we really just focus on oaks. So both of those items we'd like to hear from the Commission. But would be happy to answer any questions. Like to hear from Mr. Smizer about Solvang. I didn't find anything online, but again, that's not infallible. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Commissioner Smizer.
Well, I didn't bring the Solvang ordinances with me. But in many cities, not just Solvang, trees are handled as part of other ordinances. And in addition, particularly in terms of conditional use permits, over-the-counter permits, trees are always factored in. The City of Solvang also has ordinances regarding trimming of trees, which I noticed you don't have in this, with particular attention to those trees that are in easements, such as on sidewalks, sewer easements, power easements, sometimes even on property line issues. So they do have a number, and I'm sure Solvang is a national tree city, yeah, and therefore has other kinds of requirements as part of that program. And we also have a arborist that works for the city. So I'm sure that they can provide some and further and more specific information as to what their particular guidelines are. Mr. Chairman, can I ask some questions?
Absolutely.
While in our particular area, perhaps there's been more concern about rural oaks. In the urban area, in the San Ynez Valley, this has come up. The earlier speaker who indicated that people who have heard so many of the debates and really have not been able to differentiate between rural discussions, coastal discussions, still see their oaks as a liability. I know that Supervisor Firestone has tried to launch campaigns to inform people of what the requirements are and to provide for oaks to be seen as a benefit and to be protected. However, there still are folks that cut down their oak trees when they're considering a addition or a guest home or some sort of change in the land use on their property. I'm a little concerned about the new tree issue, and so I wanted to ask you if you have vetted this new tree concept with the community that spoke initially, and then perhaps as well with the municipalities that are located within the county, because those folks really deal with high-density urban development.
Let me just say that what we had talked about in regard to the planting of new trees, if it's a project that has a landscape plan, the new trees would be shown on a landscape plan, and that would be part of the public record. If somebody isn't doing something they need a building permit for or a land use permit for, but still want to plant oak trees and like to have them exempt, we would have to have some mechanism that would enable them to record a plan one way or another, either submit a plan to the planning department that would go on file or record it at the recorder's office. So either one of those two mechanisms, I think, could make that work.
Mr. Chair
Yes.
and Commissioner Smizer, We've not vetted with the cities because while we certainly try to be aware of cities' requirements, these wouldn't be requirements within cities. So it's just not something we've branched out and done, and certainly could if you think that would be of use. The cities in the county and the cities that we've surveyed tend to be more restrictive than the county's policies, and the county's policies exist in the community plans and aren't further implemented except in the coastal zone and the zoning ordinance. So it leaves us with some room for interpretation of those.
The reason for my question was not, I understand that the jurisdiction of the cities would trump the counties in terms of this policy, but because they are dealing with urban communities, a lot of these issues they've already dealt with. And so it might be helpful to communicate with some of the city arborists and really deal with what does the city do, for example, with new plantings. Do you save your receipts? Do you, what do you do in order to show that these trees were planted? One of my concerns with this, and maybe I can get some feedback, has to do with folks that move into on a piece of property, and for one reason or another, maybe they want their pool shielded from view. Maybe they want some shade. Maybe there's any number of variety of reasons, and really talking all the way down to pretty small pieces of property, who would plant a tree and then because 6 years down the road or 10 years down the road, they weren't ready to put a cabana up or to put a barbecue in, but now they are. Do you see this happening? Do you see folks using trees on a temporary basis where they know ahead of time that they're going to be used for shade, they're going to be used to shield views, and then they turn around and plan later on that those trees are going to be taken out or moved or replaced?
I have never heard of that specific example in regard to oak trees. A lot of times people plant a hedge and then decide to remove it or replace it later. But I've never heard that with oak trees. What might be a better example of that case is somebody planting an oak tree and then selling the property. And 10 years or 15 years goes by, and the tree turns out to be a nice tree, and the new owner goes in to try to do something. That's why if the documentation was there, if he could go back into the archives, get the plans, and it would show that that was a newly planted tree, then they would have that protection. They could remove it.
Mr. Chairman, if I could ask one more question.
Absolutely.
That just has to do with the bonding process. I'm familiar with construction bonding and with a number of other kinds of bonds. My general feeling on them is that they really are not very practical in terms of really receiving money back if you fail to perform. Is there any other methods other than a performance type bond that would be more effective and guarantee that we'll actually get a tree for a tree?
We, Mr. Chair and Commissioner Smizer, we've actually been pretty successful in recovering bonds, but assignments of deposits have been a pretty successful way, and a lot of people prefer that because at the end of the bonding, the security period, they get that entire piece of all of the money back, usually plus interest. And with a bond, they have to pay a fee to maintain a bond over time. So it kind of depends on where people are at financially as to whether they prefer a bond or an assignment of deposit or some other performance security. But our intention is to be flexible about the method to meet individual needs and still have a security that would allow the county to pull it in the event it's needed. And I just want to make it very clear that the only instances where we're proposing that some sort of security be provided is when trees are removed and replacement trees occur, which is certainly not the goal of this of our policies. That's sort of the last resort, or where they're relocated, because although relocation has become much more successful, it's still a bit of a risky proposition depending on the health of a tree and the age of a tree. So those are the only two instances where we would foresee securities being placed.
All right, thank you. Commissioner Boyson?
Oh, I'm sorry. Commissioner Smyser, are you done?
I'll just make one comment to your question, and that is, I think it's a practical methodology, and support it.
Commissioner Boyson.
I watched the Montecito Planning Commission, and I agree with you. All of a sudden we start talking about specimen trees and what are we going to call that and that sort of thing. I think good idea. Let's restrict this one to oaks first of all, and let me also say that I think that defining the critical root zone as being 5 feet beyond the drip line is absolutely necessary. I mean, this critical root zone was a joke, and how we define it, and which is a trunk and what's not a trunk, and where the tree's at. I got to tell you, though, this whole idea of a tree protection plan scares me to death, especially when we talk about things like appraisals and bonding and maintenance requirements and, describing the impacts and mitigations. This is adding. This is adding regulation. This isn't going back on a regulation. And I guess I really see this. This is one of these that I call a Gaviota Tunnel problem. This isn't a problem in North County. This is a South County problem. It is not a problem in Orcutt and Santa Maria, at least, and I'm not sure. I don't think it's a problem in Lompoc. I think we respect trees. Maybe we respect trees more in North County, but the CPR prides himself on the fact that they don't have developers as part of it. That somehow developers would taint them. I take umbrage to that a little bit, but in any event, I think that I've had developments where we've had a tree. The conditions required that we be 6 feet outside of the drip line. We go 6 feet outside of the drip line. We go, you know what? There's some bigger than feeder roots here. Maybe we ought to back off a little bit when we test it, and so we end up 7 or 8 feet outside, and I think that's just kind of the normal course of practice. Nobody wants to kill an oak tree, and developers certainly are looking at it, if nothing else, from a liability standpoint. You don't want to kill that tree and have it fallen over onto a project, and you end up with liability on it. But I think also from an environment, everybody knows how valuable trees are, and this whole idea of appraising. I mean, what are we going to do? Appraise it for its wood value, or I don't think you can really. Everybody knows how much a tree is worth. I like the idea of critical root zone, 5 feet, of defining that critical root zone as being 5 feet beyond the drip line. Although I will add, and I'll admit that there are ways to get around that. You just go in and you trim the tree before you build. We don't want that. But again, I think that's a South problem. I think we're creating problems that may or may not exist. But the tree protection plan, I just think that that's got to be at director's discretion, that if they make a determination. But I think there's some common sense things that any planner, even I could tell you that it's not going to affect that tree to cantilever a deck over a root zone.
Mr. Chair, if I could just respond briefly to Commissioner Boyson's comments, because I think it's important. First of all, I think aside from the appraisal, this is really codifying the practice and making the expectations more clear. And I think that's really what CPR wanted. So nobody who we've been speaking with was concerned about a tree report, and I would hold short of saying a tree protection plan on every single tree where there's some encroachment into the drip line or tree protection zone, but it's really a tree report where somebody who has some qualifications does some level of analysis and either says, hey, nothing needs to be done, or you need to seal the roots in this area, or you need to use this construction technique. I don't think it's an elaborate report in every instance, but I think what CPR really wanted was, let's set a standard everybody can understand, make it clear that if you can get professional advice about encroaching into the tree protection zone, that the county will be open to that advice and move on. I think it's really consistent with the way we've been implementing these policies in the past, and it's really just making it very clear. We're not intending to have a full employment act for arborists. They do very good, simple reports, and we're not intending to make it more complex on relatively simple situations. So I don't want the commission to feel like this is an increase in the regulations, because I don't think it is. The appraisal was a suggestion made by a very reputable arborist in Ojai. If the commission thinks that that's not a useful part of the tree evaluation, that's fine. But I think the rest of it really is consistent with what we've been doing. And I really do want to get away from people not knowing if they have to do any sort of analysis or not. I think it's much clearer to say, look, here's the area that where potential impacts can occur. If you go within that area, then have somebody analyze it instead of coming in and trying to, get a different result depending on which planner they get and how they look at the plans and how the plans are drawn. I think it's just clearer. And then that seemed to be the consensus of this group that does not include developers.
Everybody in the commission wants to speak, and we have somebody in the guest. So, Commissioner Boyson, you still...
Can I just follow up
Sure.
on that as far as the
And
arborist? But let me tell you what the realities are, Ms. Meester.
Okay.
The realities are, and I been through them. I have been, I had a project in North County where, the neighbors were complaining that we wouldn't take out some eucalyptus trees, and the county required us to have an arborist. At the time, the only arborists that were available were from South County.
Mm-hmm.
We have this guy come up. All of a sudden, we're cabling a bunch of shooter tree eucalyptus trees. We spent $250,000 on this thing. Arborists are going to find things. I think we've got to put some sort of a burden of proof on the county, not the other way around. I'm just real leery of this tree protection plan. The critical root zone, I buy.
Two other points. I think you're right about is this a North County issue? Is it a South County issue? I think it's a South County issue. There's some applicability in the valley because of the pattern of development that's occurring within the Santa Ynez Valley is starting to look a little bit more like South Coast development. In the North County, we tend to have larger lots, tend to have single-story homes. We don't have the same types of trees that are protected. So I agree that if we wanted to try, this in one area of the county, the South Coast and maybe the valley, and
We have some more questions.
Mr.
Go
Spicer.
ahead.
And the other point is,
Well, why don't you hold
forgot it.
Hold that thought, Commissioner
Mr.
Cooney.
Mr. Chair.
Well, wait a minute, Commissioner Brown.
I'm sorry. I'd like to hear from our public.
Well,
okay,
I'd
sorry.
be happy to do that, but
Okay.
let everybody ask the questions here. Commissioner Cooney.
All I want to do is set some background. This is obviously something that our advisors have worked on a great deal, both in-house and out-house, and I don't want to short shrift any of this discussion. But just to put it in context now, we have what Ms. Meester says is a mere clarification of existing policy for the benefit of the professionals and their clients who work with it. But there are three choices. One, so far, and not to say that we wouldn't have a fourth, but one is we stick with what the county has now and then just apply this to oak trees. Another is to go in the direction of the Montecito Commission and include other trees. If it's good for oak trees, it's good for everything. And Commissioner Boyson, in his fashion, has suggested a third alternative, which is don't do anything at all, at least north of the Gaviota Tunnel. And so, you know, I think we really have a broad-ranging discussion, and it may not be, we may not be advancing it by rushing through it. So I just want to set that if we can't do a good job with it today, then we ought to continue this to a future meeting.
Good point. Commissioner Brown.
Mr. Chair, I have some comments, but I would like to hear the speaker, and then I'm sure there will be some other things.
We'll open the
Thank you.
public hearing
Thank
now.
you.
Mr. Knight. Ken Knight.
Thank you. Again, my name is Ken Knight. I'm, again, a certified arborist, certified urban forester, and I've been doing tree protection plans for the county for the last several years. And it's not my main source of income, so I'm not here. I do a couple of them a month. I use it primarily as an educational opportunity to talk to people about how they can build with trees. So I'm not here for full employment for arborists. But, and we are on the same side in a lot of this in terms of what we're trying to do is to protect the trees, or at least to create a future where there will be trees on a property, preferably native trees. Where we differ, however, is the process of how to get there. A lot of what's been discussed today is policy, has no basis in science whatsoever. If you're talking about critical root zones, this is not something that was just made up out of thin air. This is something that is part of a very long and involved process of scientific analysis. Trees in Development is the primer. I don't think this book wasn't mentioned at all in any of the discussions here, but there's a simple calculation for tree protection zones in there, and it actually is a little bit more involved what the county uses. The critical root zone is not a complicated issue. 1 inch of diameter of the tree at breast height equals 1 foot of tree protection zone or critical root zone. That's it. It's not brain surgery. It's not complicated. There are no misunderstandings of that. If it's on a hillside, then you measure from the top in terms of trying to get to that 54-inch above the tree. If you have multiple trunks, you take the sum total of the trunks. You will have situations where, could you go back to that one spot where you had the big, the one site, yeah.
Shows the circular.
Yeah, and probably we should drop the lights on. So we had that, yeah, drop the one back here. So this one was, that's a 24-inch diameter? Yeah. Is that 24-inch deviation? Because this is 30 feet here.
Yeah, this is a
22, 30 feet. I'm sorry.
I believe that this is a very, extremely large oak tree, and so.
But it's saying right there that it's a 24-inch.
Oh, that's right. These are the tree numbers, Ken.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So it doesn't indicate.
So there was a big tree there. Let's say whatever it was, it created a big zone there. When I'm looking at a tree protection plan, I'm a partner with the owner of the property. My job is to make sure that they can get the full use of their property, to get the whatever they want done in there. If they have to remove some trees, they have to remove some trees. But we want to thereby create not only a place where any existing trees can grow and thrive, but also if they have to remove some mitigation, so plant some trees in other areas. We're partners in this process. We want to make this work because we know if it doesn't work, the property owner will make sure that that tree is either killed or is, as Commissioner Boysen was talking about before, if you adopted a different method of the drip line, they'll cut the tree at the drip line. And they'll just cut the boughs off, and you'll have a different way of, different problem. I think what we have here, we also have a very succinct and scientific process for report writing that we use, and it's very clear, lays out all the different aspects of what should be in a tree protection plan. But I think what's most important, what we have to get across, is that we're not here to just be tree huggers and save every tree no matter what. We're here to promote an environment where trees will be here 50, 60, 100 years from now. And that's my objective going into this, but at the same time, working with the developer. So we're all on the same page here as how to get to that. And my concern here is that we move away from science and we move more towards policy. And a tree protection zone that says use the drip line plus 5 feet doesn't reflect reality. If we saw I think there was a schematic there of a tree up there. The roots go off in all different directions, and it may or may not be correct it is not correct to do a 5 feet away from the tree, because particularly as trees get older, if you can imagine a wine glass with the glass of the wine, the cup of the
upper
glass
portion
being the canopy of the tree, the stem is the trunk. The roots spread out over the ground within the first several feet of the surface. Now, there's a big taproot for the oaks, but a lot of the tree roots are on the top surface of them. And if you cut them, that's the problem. Or worse, if you bring construction equipment in and roll over them even once, you've basically compromised that tree. You may not see those effects for months, maybe even not years, but you've compromised a tree that could live for maybe a long, long time. And we want to protect those trees. And so that, for example, here, if you stop this here, and you start chopping off the edge of that, I think that's a good example. In fact, there's lots of roots, and particularly the sensitive roots out at the end where you're getting most of the water for the tree. And that's usually what happens during construction, is that trees die because they don't get enough water because their roots have been compacted and they get suffocated, or they get chopped off, the real fine roots, and you have the real thick roots left, but the tree can't support its canopy. So my bottom line is I appreciate what CPR is trying to say. They're trying to say, there's a fear out there. And part of that fear should be allayed by the fact that we're partners in this process. The people that are working, particularly the arborists, are working to create a situation that is in the best interest of the clients. We, for example, will give out materials to show people what can be done. But changing the drip line policy, the policy from critical root zone to drip line, I think is not good science.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Knight. Commissioner Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate Commissioner Cooney's comments. I don't think that we're quite ready to move on yet. I would like to echo Mr. Knight's comment about the science versus the desire to improve a process, which seems perhaps cumbersome and difficult. I mean, the goal of everybody is to retain as many trees as possible, but this reminds me of sort of those packaged sewer treatment plants. I just see what I read in these documents, but what is in fact the science, and it would be helpful to actually know what the science is in order to be able to make the policy. It is interesting that cities have more strict tree protection guidelines in the county. In fact, they have tree ordinances that deal with, if you ever look like LA counties or LA cities, it's pages of things to do to protect trees, because I suspect people living in cities appreciate trees more. There's more trees, there's the urban forest, whereas this is more probably specifically a Montecito issue than it is certainly more than a North County issue. I am concerned that in some way what is trying to be done is to change how the interpretation in the community plans, because I realize they are all different. And with my community updating, in the process of updating their community plan, I think it might be important for them to be aware of some of these problems or some of these issues, and to have them look at it rather than just sort of make a blanket change in policy for everybody in the county, because I do wonder if it's really that necessary. Lots of issues on pruning and removing trees. And I don't even know how that would be integrated in all this, but I do see it as becoming a lot more complicated, notwithstanding your desire to try to make it simpler for all. And I would hope that would be everybody's goal, but I think that for me it would be about knowing a little bit more about the science and what might in fact be possible and how we best can do it. And maybe there are some arborists out there who could make the recommendations. In fact, were there not some, as part of the process improvement effort several years ago, where you had some arborists who got together and did talk about this? And I just wondered, whatever happened to that effort?
But before you respond, we're trying to identify here how to better do and protect these trees. But in all the rules that we make, all the development standards, all the policies, if we don't have any enforcement, none of this means anything. And if you don't have enforcement, I know in our city we had rules about trees. Everybody had to have a tree. You couldn't trim it and so on. Well, there wasn't any enforcement. People took their trees down. In many streets now you'll see where we put in street trees, or we put in 30 or 40 street trees, you'll see 4 because there isn't any enforcement. So if you make these rules here, be prepared to have enforcement, or it doesn't mean anything. If you don't have enforcement, it doesn't mean anything. You can have as many rules as you want. Many times when we approve developments and they say we're going to put these shrubs in, we demand that they put certain shrubs in and all that. I recall Lansing Duncan reminding me a couple of times that 2 years later he'd drive by and they were all dried out, they're gone, they didn't maintain them, you know. So if there isn't any enforcement, it doesn't mean anything, all the rules that you make. Go ahead, Ms. Meester.
I seem to be having a hard time maintaining a train of thought today because I forget what I was going to say. It probably is, I hate to say. Oh, the arbor. Okay, going back to what happened to that group. Mr. Chair and Commissioner Brown, there was a group that was quite focused on this tree issue, and it was headed up by some people on my staff, Susan Vanetta, a local landscape architect. There were several arborists on it, biologists on it, and we could certainly take this back. We sort of tried to pick up where we left off and bring something back to the commission through Community Planning Renaissance, but we could certainly
can we get that information? Did they provide any reports or anything?
Chairman Valencia,
yeah,
Commissioner
we had a
Brown.
draft.
Yeah, there was a draft that came out of that study group. I actually have a PowerPoint presentation prepared by 2 of the biologists who worked on that team that in fact, and as I said earlier, there's probably flaws with any kind of tree protection zone system you use. And in this PowerPoint presentation, they identify the flaws with the critical root zone. So we can engage Ken and others to get back together and work through this study session. I think Commissioner Cooney probably said it best. It seems like this is a common theme when you try to legislate common sense. We end up in a much larger discussion of possible problem. Are we creating more problems than we're really solving? This really was all about an effort to introduce common sense in the planning review process so that when a potential, and I don't use developer as a dirty word, believe me, Commissioner Boyson, we love our developers. When they follow our advice, it's great. We want to be able to advise our clients and property owners with clear conviction in the direction that we provide them with, which is you can save this, please do not harm your tree. It is an asset to you as you recognize, and we know you want to save this tree. When you file that application, you're going to be treated with the same kind of common sense by the planning staff in the review of appropriate mitigation where necessary and protection during construction, and this tree can stay along with your proposed development. That's really what we're after. And so when we take that next step and try to somehow formally document that or and I use legislative a little strongly there, but legislate that common sense, we come into this much larger discussion. So I am enthusiastic about taking this to the next step. Let's maybe perhaps come back in another workshop and get some of the other scientists on board and take this to that next level if you agree that that's an appropriate next step.
Commissioner Smyser.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I hadn't spoken about the San Ynez Valley in terms of what I personally feel, but I think you've got a number of issues here. You have municipalities, Solvang, Buellton. You've got the San Ynez Valley Plan, which is being worked on, finalized. You have the Los Alamos Community Plan, which is just beginning. I would advise against making yet another overlay to be added to the San Ynez Valley without some community input from San Ynez Valley Plan Committee, the Los Alamos Community Plan process, the two cities where I see this actually most implemented is already implemented, and it's implemented within the two communities of Buellton and Solvang. The rest of the San Ynez Valley have much larger properties. We're talking about minimum lot sizes of an acre in most cases, many of them 5, 10, and more acres. And you know, I kind of think about, I'm going to relate a little bit to Jack. About 3 weeks ago, I was at a friend's house. We were outdoor barbecue, and we heard this tremendous crack. And it was one of their giant oaks that had just exploded and broken off. And the family was devastated, absolutely devastated. They didn't even want to continue on with the barbecue. I mean, it was like we went from this joyous time of celebrating to a time when they were just, the tree has, you know, lost a major trunk, and now the view is different, and it was just, you know, they were very, very concerned. I think that reflects the general attitude of most homeowners toward their trees. I would agree with the CPR folks that said, you know, the folks that buy a piece of property, they buy it many times based upon what the plantings are. And then if they're unsatisfied with the plantings, they plant. And they actually go a step further and create a landscaping plan. So I'm not sure that we really do need to legislate this. I do think that if we can make some clarifications on the current plan, that would be appropriate science and yet easy enough for a landowner to understand and to implement. I am a little bit leery of, and I know, and with all due respect, I know Mr. Knight's a wonderful arborist and he's got great programs, and I'm a big supporter of Goleta Beautiful and all of what you're doing there. But I think sometimes when you work with something every day in and day out, you may think that it's simple because you do it every day, whereas maybe the common property owner thinks, you know, gosh, I don't even know where to begin. So I don't know if it's possible to wed both of those, but I do recognize the concern. I would caution also against making any kind of rash decision and having this body do something that the communities affected would really be quite upset about, perhaps.
Thank you, Commissioner Boyson.
Yeah, I just question for staff. At the Montecito Planning Commission, they discussed a 2002 memo from Rita Bright that was provided to them. Could you provide that to us for the return trip on this subject?
Sure, we'll get you a copy of it today. It actually did come to the Planning Commission, although probably not these members of the Planning Commission back in 2002.
Okay, but this looked like it was something that had been provided to the Montecito Commission.
Yeah, we did.
Okay, thanks.
All right.
It was submitted, so we provided it.
Any further comments? Did we drive this into the ground? Looks like we want to think twice about writing a procedure to read the procedures. So take it back and rework it and come back to us at a later date.
Great.
That
Thank
sound
you.
right? Okay.
That sounds like what I heard too.
All right. Any other comments from the staff? Commissioner Cooney?
I agree with the comment made earlier by the chair that this is an education in process for many of us, certainly for me. I do think there's a problem with people in my neighborhood and surrounding worried about the impact of their oak trees on future development. They operate from a lack of knowledge. So to the extent we're doing this today, even to point out what is and isn't a problem, I think is helpful. So I'm not discouraging you. I hope the commission is not, from continuing the process. I just think we need to take it in a little smaller steps.
All right, thank you. Anybody else? All right.
I was just going to
yes.
wish Miss Meester a very happy wedding and good
you.
luck.
Yes,
Thank you.
Ms. Meester.
I will.
All right.
Believe me, I will.
Yes, Mr. Easton?
Well, if I could have just one little final word.
Sure, certainly.
For myself. I don't know if Laurel wants to say anything here, but it's been very interesting, and thank you very much for taking the time to listen to our efforts, and thank you for the planning staff and Pat Saley to work with us on this to try to get this straightened out. But really, it's a very simple situation, and certainly we're not sitting here saying we want to defy science and go back to pre-Darwinism or whatever. I don't know about oak trees. A lot of very competent arborists who are active in practice go for the drip line plus 5 feet. Obviously, there's a lot of communities around that are doing this, and I've talked to arborists who believe that it is a practical methodology. Just because the critical root zone is the latest product of some arborists or scientists working with trees doesn't mean that in all aspects it's the right thing to use. Unfortunately, the public sees it as a complex issue. They don't understand it, and what I'm trying to do, Commissioner Boyson, is try to come up with a rational process where we in the design profession and clients can say, we're going to get a rational response to the use of these trees, whether it be a common sense response, and not have the decision made by the head of the planning department. In other words, I would like to see, as a professional, to know that I could rely on a rational interpretation of a situation and not perhaps an opinion by the head of the planning department. And so that's what certainly my basis of working on this is, to try to get a arborist report that would be filed simply and effectively by means of a form that would be prepared by the county, and that the decision would be made on the basis of the performance of that report. And in actuality, it doesn't make any difference whether it's critical root zone or drip line and 5 feet if it's based on that rational procedure. However, the critical root zone associated with science and the higher purpose and God, so to speak, gives people an interpretive right to do an interpretation that I think in many times is not realistic within the context of the actual development of a piece of property. And what we'd like to do is bring it into a realistic, practical, down-to-earth interpretation of the rules and regulations are already there, Commissioner Smeisner. I mean, they're using something there. We just want to replace those with something that's simpler and more practical, not create a new layer of bureaucracy or a new thing. We just want to simplify what is already being used. And basically, that's what we're trying to do. Laurel, do you have anything else to say?
Mr. Easton, Mr. Knight said he was a member of your group, but I kind of sense that there was a little difference in the way you both feel about this truth.
I'm not a member of the group.
Oh, not a member of the group?
I sympathize with what they're trying to do.
Oh, that seems like you had a difference of opinion a little bit. You know, it wasn't mentioned just right. Yes, Commissioner.
Mr. Easton, maybe you misunderstood me. I would always give you that opportunity of going to an arborist and getting a tree protection plan. I'm just saying in those cases where it's real obvious, the director could make a call and say, listen, we don't need a tree protection plan in this. It would always be your right as a private citizen to challenge any decision that is made by the county and bring in your own experts. I would never, I mean, it's like Ms. Perez saying she's trying to add common sense to the government process. I consider that to be an absolutely noble effort. But you would...
Difficult effort.
Very difficult, almost impossible probably. But I would certainly always give the applicant that opportunity to challenge any decision that's made by this county or by anybody in government.
But that does tend to scare the public. That does tend to scare the public, and I think to get confidence with the public is to put it try to put it on a rational basis.
Yeah.
That
well,
the public.
We may disagree on that. If you're asking me to support more legislation rather than less, it ain't going to happen. But
we don't want more legislation. We want to clarify and simplify what they're already using.
Yeah, that clarify and simplify. Anyways, I'll enjoy having future discussions. Thanks.
Commissioner Brown, you had one comment before he... No, you're fine. Anybody else? All right, with that, the Planning Commission has completed its work for today. Thank you very much. This meeting is adjourned.